is a very important one. This is what we want to address now. Historically, making decisions about various options was considered the role of reason. And this is a very interesting kind of view. We choose between different options because we have this reasoning ability. And this has been just a historical kind of view of this from the very beginning, that we weigh various options and we use reason to weigh those various options to make choices. What we want to discuss in this lecture is a new paradigm. And that new paradigm says that emotion plays a role in this process, that it's emotion which guides us in being able to choose between various options. This is a very, very different sort of paradigm. Now remember, we make a distinction here, and whenever you read any books by individuals who talk about these things, or you listen to any lectures on this, make sure you understand how someone defines things. Here we're defining emotion as being a sort of physiological response, and feelings as being the internal subjective state or feeling that we have about that emotion. So it's the internal subjective state. To appreciate the significance of the current view that we now have about the role that emotions plays in helping us choose between various options that are presented because of our incredible memory and plasticity, and the role that emotions play in all of this, we have to look at how emotions have been viewed in general, in a historical way, predominantly by philosophers. Now, it isn't just philosophers that have been interested in these questions. Historically, the philosophers were the first to address the questions, but psychologists and later neuroscientists have all pondered the role of emotion and what its role is in human behavior, how it affects human action. We saw in our very first lecture, for example, that there was a Western philosophical tradition, and this also is a scientific tradition, and that is that we have ascribed in the West to a certain type of dualism, and that's the view that emotions and reasoning were very separate. So this leads us back to our discussion of Descartes. And Descartes, of course, being the father of Western philosophy, and as you remember, rightly or wrongly, he was the individual who articulated best this concept of dualism, and that is that there is a separation of mind and body. So dualism maintains that the body and the mind are composed of two separate kinds of entities and that they're independent. You remember that it was Descartes who had to find a place in the body, in the brain basically, where the rational mind could interact with the body. And he had to do this because he had to be able to have something like morals, which he considered to be the product of reason, had to have morals interact somewhere with the body. Otherwise, morals couldn't change behavior. So behavior was the result of the body, so you had to have some place. And he postulated the pineal was the place where that rational mind and the body were to interact. But always remember, and this is again the tradition, our Western tradition, that morals are the product of reason. So these would be the product of that rational mind, the rational mind that Descartes postulated. Now, a corollary of dualism was that the body was seen as the place of emotions, and emotions were seen as animalistic and lowly. Now, this in part is because even the earliest people, earliest human beings, obviously noticed that animals seemed to have emotions. And so what separated human beings was this rational solar mind. So only human beings were capable of reason, of rationality. So it was only humans that possessed this. So this sort of separated again this idea of emotions in the body and the rational soul as being something that humans had, two separate entities, this dualistic view. And in fact, an extreme dualism sees emotional behavior as antithetical to rational behavior. This legacy of Descartes and others has been a powerful paradigm in Western philosophy, in literature, and even in the sociological and political realms. Moral judgments are made about the value of entire classes of individuals. For example, women, who were considered more emotional than men. And women seem to be more tied to their bodies, probably because of their childbearing role. And so women were seen as more animalistic, more emotional. In our modern world, which is flat, in our modern world, judgments are made about entire cultures of individuals. And this still shows us that the remnants of dualism are still with us. And in both cases that I've used as examples of entire groups of individuals seen as more emotional, they are also seen as less rational, and in a very real sense, by extension, sometimes less human. Modern neuroscience would suggest this is a faulty paradigm, that it is the paradigm itself which is wrong. While not denying that under certain circumstances emotions can almost be overwhelming or paralyzing, we now see that under appropriate conditions, emotions actually help guide us in making decisions. So later we're going to see in another lecture that males and females may in fact be processing emotional information differently, but all human beings use emotion to help guide their rational behavior. And so this is definitely a new paradigm. So what we want to look at is in normal behavior, what is the role of emotion? What is this new paradigm? Well, increasing numbers of philosophers, of psychologists, and of neuroscience have begun to appreciate that emotions, and in humans the mental representation of emotions, which we subjectively experience as our feelings, are absolutely necessary for rational behavior. This is so important. Let me repeat this. Emotions, and in humans, the mental representation of emotions, which are subjectively experienced as feelings, are absolutely necessary for rational behavior. So what has contributed to this major paradigm shift? Again, we're going to derive our evidence from research and also from philosophical inquiry and also, of course, from the clinic. In this new paradigm, it is the ability of emotion to guide behavior, to contribute to this rational decision-making process that is most relevant. So let's look at some of this evidence. Our first line of evidence is drawn from the field of comparative neurology. And you'll remember that comparative neurology is the comparison of brains across different animals. This clearly supports the conclusion that there has been an enormous elaboration or differentiation of neocortical areas that are involved both in the elaboration of emotional function and also in executive function in the brain. So we have these incredible prefrontal area here, which has undergone this differentiation, and this area is separated into a limbic area involved in the processing of emotion and also an area involved in executive function. And both of these areas show an increase in differentiation. So whereas our phrenologists thought that intelligence was located up here in the front, now we know that a lot of this frontal part of our brain, which seems so characteristic for humans, is really involved in the processing of emotional information. So, for example, this area right here, which would be right above the orbit of the eye, called the orbital frontal cortex, is part of that limbic association area. And the orbital frontal cortex is one of the areas that is implicated in our ability to abstract and to apply to behavior the mores of our culture. So applying morals to behavior involves limbic cortex, which elaborates emotional experience, not rational thinking. And so here again we have this suggestion that it is emotion that is important in this process. And this will be true regardless of whether you're male or female and across all cultures. Remember traditionally, however, and remember Descartes, moral behavior was seen as a rational behavior. It was seen as part of a rational process or the process of reason, not of emotion. But note something. We develop very strong feelings about morality. We develop very strong feelings about what we believe is right and what we believe is wrong. We develop strong feelings about the morality of other human beings and whether they are behaving in a way we judge is right or wrong. Moreover, when we live up to the moral code of our particular culture or our subgroup, whatever we identify with, following these rules leads to activation of an endogenous reward system. And because of this, when we follow the code of behavior that we believe in, we actually feel better. We feel good. And the converse is also true, that we feel negative emotions, we feel shame, we feel guilt when we fail to live up to the ethical code we say we believe in. So it is the feelings, the subjective feelings involve cortex, and this is one of the main areas which is involved. We now know, of course, that we don't decide on a moral code because we think about it, but because the orbital frontal cortex plays a role in the abstraction of the mores of our culture. And this is particularly true in the personal and social realms, in a way which is similar, we think, to the way that the brain abstracts the rules of language. So our brains are capable of hearing all the sounds in language, and depending on what you're exposed to, those are the rules and sounds that you will apply when you learn how to speak language and understand it. The same thing appears to be true in moral behavior. The orbital frontal cortex is capable of abstracting the rules of social interaction from the time you're born. So the rules start to be abstracted by what you observe long before you're capable of applying any kind of rational thought process to this. Now, this is interesting in the regard because look at something like sexism or racism. Generally, individuals don't really move that far away from the moral code that they're exposed to as children. Now, that isn't necessarily true, but if you look at adults, you will see that usually they reflect a moral value system very similar to their parents. Now, some individuals, as they age, start reflecting on the values that they have. And yes, we are plastic. Yes, we can be different. But this comes much later. Early on, our brain simply abstracts the rules. We also have this elaboration of this dorsolateral frontal area, which is involved in executive function. And so we know that executive function is important and gets pulled into this. This is also very highly differentiated in us, and it plays a critical role as well. This is an area which helps us prioritize behavior, and again, this would play a role in decision making. These areas are complexly connected to one another. So they aren't just separate areas functioning independently. This means that moral behavior in our experience and in our brains is not separate. They're complexly interconnected. Now, other experimental data derives from the field of moral psychology, and this is a very, very interesting area. This is where individuals are asked to choose in a moral dilemma between one option or another. And using functional fMRI, these individuals are put in a scanner, and the different areas of the brain that are active during this moral decision process are looked at, so can be viewed. So here's an example of a moral dilemma. There's a runaway trolley, and it's headed down a track, and it will kill 5 people. You have the ability to flip a switch and make that trolley go down another track, but in this case, 1 individual will die. Across cultures, across all religions, and regardless of whether you're male and female, most individuals will say, yes, you should flip that switch. And this is called a moral impersonal dilemma, because you have to do something that is impersonal, flipping that switch to save the 5 people, but this is at the cost of that 1 life. This is opposed to a moral personal dilemma, which is where that trolley is still going down, is still going to kill 5 people. But now you have to push off of a platform this rather large human being who's standing next to you, and his falling across that track is now going to stop that trolley. This is called moral personal, because now you have to take an active role personally in pushing that person off. Across all cultures, all religions, again, males and females say, no, that would be immoral. Well, it turns out when they look at the brain and look at the areas of the brain which light up under these conditions, the brain is most activated in these areas of the orbital frontal cortex and other areas of the limbic system, which again are learning, memory, and emotion. So the limbic system lights up most when it's a moral personal dilemma, a moral personal decision that needs to be made. And so here is part of our evidence that in fact the guiding of being able to decide what you believe is moral or not moral, the decision-making process brings emotions into play. When you make more judgments which are not moral, so you make morally neutral judgments, these areas of the brain in fact do not light up. So it would indicate that the type of judgments which are most important that human beings make require these emotional areas of the brain that help you choose between options in dilemmas. Now, in addition to research data, the conclusion that emotions play a role in rational judgment has also been made by a number of contemporary philosophers. And while our course is focused on the basic knowledge which is related specifically to neuroscience, it would be unfair not to mention that there's a vast and incredibly important body of knowledge out there that has been generated by contemporary philosophers. They have reached a similar conclusion coming from very, very different point of view. And that is that emotions help guide us in rational decisions. For a variety of these viewpoints, you're encouraged to pursue excellent discussions. I'd like to recommend 2. Ron D'Souza and Robert Solomon have both written numerous books, and they are champions of emotions as being rational judgments themselves, and point out how important emotions are in our ability to make rational decisions. And some of their work is listed in the bibliography. Now, lastly, as with most of the topics we've covered in this course, we need to turn to the clinic. This helps us gain an understanding like no other, since it's human beings that have this ability to reason. So if we want to look at this larger process and the role that emotion plays, we need to go to the clinic. And much of our understanding of the role of feelings in rational behavior has come from there. And we can basically summarize this by reviewing a single clinical case who has been followed for a number of years and very carefully by neurologists. We have other patients who have similar types of lesions, so there are now a number of individuals who are being followed who have had similar brain damage. I personally believe this patient, referred to as Elliot, is as important to our understanding of the role of emotion in rational behavior as the patient HM was to our understanding of memory, and Phineas Gage was to our understanding of personality. The patient is an individual named Elliot, And Elliot was a patient of Antonio Damasio, a physician who has contributed enormously to our understanding of the role of emotions in helping guide rational behavior. Elliot was a young man of very high IQ who appeared to have undergone a major change in his personality after developing and then having surgery to remove a brain tumor. The damage to the brain involved both of his prefrontal cortices, more right than left, and it also damaged the axons that were underneath this prefrontal area. In some ways, his lesion was similar to that of Phineas Gage. But unlike Phineas Gage, Elliot didn't show some of the sort of egregious behavior that Phineas Gage showed after his brain damage. He wasn't irascible or difficult to get along with. So while the lesions seem to be similar, one of the things neuroscientists are interested in is determining what is the difference between the two, because on the surface it looked like they were very similar. They did have some other similarities, however. Both individuals, after their brain damage, became collectors. So Phineas Gage became a collector of animals and objects, and Elliot also became a collector of objects. So they did have some things in common. One of the most dramatic consequences of the damage that was seen in Elliot, however, was his loss of emotions. And more specifically, Elliot lost his feelings. He lost having a subjective experience of emotion. This was incredible because he could remember that he used to feel emotion, and he could describe what it was, but he could no longer feel it. He no longer had an internal subjective ability to experience emotion. What has turned out to be most enlightening about Elliot's case, and again, he's been followed for years, is that Elliot could not make rational decisions any longer. He could discuss the pros and cons of any options presented to him. His IQ was intact. His rational ability was intact. In fact, you could hardly tell there was anything different about Elliot until he was asked to make a decision. He could not do it. He could not weigh the different options. He had nothing that guided him to choose one option over another. Without this internal subjective experience of emotion, without his feelings, Elliot could not make rational decisions. And so this in itself has been very, very interesting. And his difficulty was most pronounced in the social and personal realms. I have wanted to read to you one of the quotes. This is out of Antonio Damasio's Descartes' Error. It's an old book, but it's one of the places he first described this patient, Elliot. And this is just really interesting. It's very good reading. Damasio is talking about how when Elliot would talk about his experiences, and he seemed to be very flat because he no longer experienced emotion, Damasio said there was no indication that Elliot was suffering in any way. He had no emotions. In fact, Damasio makes the statement that he was suffering more than Elliot seemed to be suffering, because, of course, Damasio's emotions were intact. He says, he, meaning Elliot, told me without equivocation that his own feelings had changed from before his illness. He could sense how topics that had once evoked a strong emotion no longer caused any reaction, positive or negative. This was astounding. Try to imagine it. Try to imagine not feeling pleasure when you contemplate a painting you love or hear a favorite piece of music. Try to imagine yourself forever robbed of that possibility and yet aware of the intellectual contents of the visual or musical stimulus, and also aware that once it did give you pleasure. We might summarize Eliot's predicament as to know but not to feel. And Eliot has been studied again for many years. He is unable to choose between various options that are offered to him. One of the ways we set goals, one of the ways we make decisions in our lives is because we are motivated by the feelings that we feel towards something. So it helps us in making decisions. Thus, observations from comparative neurology, from psychology, from philosophy, and even from the clinic have forced a reevaluation of the role that emotions play in rational behavior. And our conclusion is that just like overwhelming emotions can paralyze us and make us irrational, failing to engage our emotions results in irrational decisions as well. So this is a very powerful new paradigm. It's believed that this confers to us an enormous adaptive advantage. It allows learning and memory, previous experience, and our feelings related to that previous experience to influence present action. Without emotions, we are like the patient Elliot. We cannot act in our own best interests when we're faced with multiple options. Note that in neurologically normal individuals, we learn from experience, and that our decisions we make also influence the decisions we make in the future. And so we learn from things and we develop feelings about those decisions that are made, and hopefully can learn over time to use emotions to help guide us in making the very best decisions. Humans are not so characterized by their ability to reason as they are by their incredible elaboration of emotional expression that guides their behavior. If we want to understand other people, we want to understand people of other cultures, we want to understand ourselves better, we need to focus more on understanding how emotions guide all of us in making the decisions that we do. Thank you.